Hi, everybody. Welcome to our last lecture in Global Political Economy in POS 201 Introduction to Politics. In today's lecture, we're going to talk about the relationship between the state and the market. We're going to talk about mercantilism, the development of liberal thought, the Bretton Woods system, North versus South conflicts and the global distribution of wealth, and also globalization and the financial crisis of 2008. When we talk about political economy, we're talking about a field of study which lies at the intersection of politics and economics. It's concerned primarily with the relationship between states and markets. When we're talking about the state, we're talking about political forces. We're usually talking about governments, for example. When we talk about the market, we're talking about the forum where sellers and buyers exchange goods and services at prices and output levels determined by supply and demand. So we're talking about the private market. We're talking about where individuals buy and sell goods. Traditionally, the interests of states and the interests of markets are often viewed in opposition to each other. This is because the state desires to maintain its sovereignty over territorial borders and to promote political unity. The market, on the other hand, thrives on openness with few barriers to trade, and the state is often seen as an impediment to both openness and to barriers to trade, to free trade. In reality, though, we see that the state is often needed to protect property rights, provide infrastructure, and regulate financial transactions. Essentially, when economies thrive, we often see a strong national state with political and military power. When we look at the development of the international market and the relationship between the international market and the state, the first primary type of political institutions we see used mercantilism. Mercantilism is a doctrine suggesting that nations should essentially sell more products than they buy. This keeps them rich because they're taking in more money than they're spending. They can then reinvest that money into their military, so this keeps their military strong. And this doctrine is completely predicated, is completely devoted to keeping states powerful. So mercantilism was very popular in Europe from the 1400s to the 1700s. European states were compelled to protect their own markets while seeking to export and create new markets. So European states are looking to export so they can sell their products abroad. That gives them money, and then they can reinvest in their militaries. This leads directly to colonialism because you can go and colonize new areas where you're going to sell your exports, okay, and then you can bring that money back to your home state. Mercantilism, above all, is predicated on the belief that economic considerations should be subordinated to political considerations. Increasing national power was the most important goal. However, mercantilism is going to be challenged as we move into the 1700s, particularly by Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. He advocated free trade, and he suggested that states are better off when they produce the goods that they are best at producing. They then trade with other states who have specialized in other goods. So, for example, it might be the case that England was better at producing ships, while France was better at producing, for example, I don't know, trees or lumber. In that case, France should specialize in producing lumber, while England should specialize in producing ships, right? In that sense, that they're both going to be more efficient at producing both of those products. And the idea is that rather than the state getting involved in trying to force the market to produce something it's not necessarily efficient at doing, all nations are better off if they allow the market to decide what states are more efficient at producing. This is a reflection of laissez-faire economics, that the state should stay out of private economic transactions. It's opposed to mercantilism and state corruption. It still suggests, however, that states are essential to protect property rights, that the state needs to make sure that nobody can step in and take someone's property from them. Farther along in the 20th century, another very influential thinker is John Maynard Keynes, who also believed in free markets, but also suggested that the state is essential to produce social, political, and economic conditions for human well-being. In other words, the market generally functions well when it's left on its own, but not always. Sometimes the state has to step in, regulate the market, and protect individuals. So social welfare policies are important because sometimes the market might not do an excellent job at making sure that everyone is employed, and so the state has to make sure that everyone can have a basic standard of living. As liberal thought further develops, we move in the 1980s to something called neoliberalism, and this is often associated with the economic thinking of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. It assumes that markets function best when the state is as minimally involved as possible. So it advocates rolling back welfare reform, financial regulation. It's very different from Keynesianism. It suggests that the state should have as little involvement in the market as possible. A very contending perspective is Marxism and critical international political economy. We've spent a lot of time in this class talking about Marxism, so we won't necessarily dwell on it quite a bit here. But of course, Marxism has a direct emphasis on class struggle, imperialism, exploitation of the working classes, and so on. So there's an emphasis on class differences and the distribution of wealth, that we have very few rich capitalists and a large majority of individuals who are relatively poor and are part of the proletariat class. Dependency theory and world systems theory, which we have discussed in this course, are examples of Marxism and critical international political economy. Another important subject to discuss in the development of the international political economy is the development of a post-war international economic order. So following the Second World War and the Great Depression, world leaders sent delegates to Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. They were trying to create financial institutions that could prevent another Great Depression from ever happening again. And the emphasis was on encouraging liberal economic principles. Part of the problem with the Great Depression was that once financial crises started to hit, countries closed their borders to trade, and was widely viewed as having worsened the Great Depression. So we had the development of the Bretton Woods institutions. This included the development of the International Monetary Fund, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which would later become known as the World Bank. And we also had the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT. This was eventually replaced by the World Trade Organization in 1995, but it essentially dealt with rules for developing trade between nations and encouraging free trade and not protectionism through tariffs.